Hello and welcome to GHHU 2901 Online Research for College Students. This is our 9th lecture in a series of 10, and this week we're going to talk about how to work with sources in APA style. So, just to recap from last week, first up, hey, congrats. We have this lecture, and then we have one more, and then we're finished with the course. That has gone super quick. I hope you've been enjoying this. Next week, we're going to wrap up. We do have that big annotated bibliography assignment due at the end of this week, so you're going to want to take all the material you learned from last week, week 8, and this week, week 9, and create that annotated bib. As always, I'm here. If you need me, just shoot me an email, and I can get back to you super quick. But to recap from last week, you should be part of the conversation that goes on around you. You know, as a college student, you need to adhere to kind of the norms and the rules of how to do this, citing your sources. This week, I'm going to show you how to do it in the text of your paper, but last week, we really focused on the reference list and how to go about doing it there. Last week, we talked about those APA citations and how to format them. We went through the big 4 that you need to know, and then how to look up the others. And then we went over what an annotated bibliography should look like. There's a nice piece towards the middle end of that video where it shows you how to actually format the annotated bibliography. That's something you're going to want to recap for this coming week. So, with that, let's jump in. APA style is a little different than regular writing. You know, other styles tend to want you to be creative and use variation in language and make your sentences flow. APA is not like that. It's different. It wants your writing to follow almost a formula kind of style. But the good news is that once you learn the formula, it becomes super easy. APA is all about adhering to the formatting rules, keeping your sentence structure simple, and maintaining parallel structures, meaning that you should stick with a style of short sentences and continue with the short sentences. I found when I first started writing in APA style that I felt my writing was choppy, that I would use a sentence and then another sentence and then another sentence, and I really wouldn't connect them as much as I would if I were writing in MLA. That's what APA looks for. They look for those short, simple, direct kind of sentences. So keep that in mind as we look at the next couple slides. Here is a sentence, the first one. So one sentence and 2 sentences. This is 2 sentences. It's kind of long. It takes up 3 lines. So could you make this any more simple? Could you reduce this into a smaller phrase? So this says, the authors had another interesting idea to investigate. They wanted to investigate whether marital conflict would predict behavior problems in children, and they wanted to know if the effect was greater for girls than for boys, particularly when they examined 2 different age groups. Is there any way you could shorten this into one sentence that, is less of a mouthful? Well, I'm going to show you. So here's an example where I took that and I condensed it. I also upped my language a little bit, where I made my language a little more complex, but I made the sentences shorter. So I say, the researchers examined the effect of marital conflict on males and females within 2 different age groups. They hypothesized the effect would be stronger in the female cohort. So if you see what I did, I took out they were investigating and they wanted to investigate. I just threw all that out. And then I just really got to the heart of what it is. But I also, instead of saying boys and girls, I talked about males and females. Just to make my language a little bit more formal and direct. Another thing you need to know when you write in APA style is that you should avoid using the words prove or proves. We don't do that. It's super hard to prove something for sure, as I'm sure we all know after the fake news week. Whenever you're writing in anything that has anything to do with any kind of science, we never say proves. It's just something we don't do. We can talk about giving support to or providing evidence for or hypothesizing that or this indicates, but we can't say prove or proves. That bar is way too high for the work we're going to do. You should also avoid using first person. So unless your professor says, I want you to use first person, don't. Say things like the author or the researcher. Don't say things like I studied. You also want to use third person and passive voice. So you're going to say things like the research showed or our research included. This is not as I experimented and found. Instead, you're going to say the research showed, because you're taking yourself out of it and you're making it less active. This is probably very much against everything you've ever heard in English class, by the way, because most English classes are very much use active voice, use first person when you need to, make your sentences flow, don't make it choppy. If you've ever had that comment on your English papers as this is choppy or awkward sentence, APA style is probably going to be your favorite. In APA, we use the Oxford comma. So, you know how you can make lists of like 3 or more things in your text? And you could say his, her, and mine. You notice the Oxford comma is this comma, and it's including that comma before the word and. Other styles of writing don't use the Oxford comma. They just use this, and they use her, his, and mine. And you're expected to know that these are 3 separate people because you're supposed to. But in APA, we use the Oxford comma, which is this one, which is the comma before and, which I think makes pretty clear that you're looking at 3 separate people. Here's a biggie, abbreviations. You're going to want to spell them out first. So saying things like some registered nurses earn bachelors of science in nursing degrees. You're going to want to say some registered nurses, and then in parentheses, RN, earn Bachelor of Science in Nursing, or BSN, degrees. After you've done that once in your paper, then you just use the abbreviations. Don't just jump in and use like RN or use any kind of abbreviation without first spelling it out. That's super helpful for someone who reads a lot of papers, is seeing it right up the front, because that's usually one of those things that I'll highlight so I can refer back to. And I promise you, your professors are doing that as well. Contractions in APA, don't use them. I chuckle with that, because contractions are like don'ts, it's, shouldn't. You should not use these. This is like the hardest thing for me to incorporate into my writing, and I still run into this issue. I'm from New York. You know that by now. You probably hear it in the voice. We use contractions all day long in everyday speech. But I know when I'm doing my formal academic writing, I have to not use contractions. I have to spell them out. I have to say things like it is, do not, should not. It's tough, but that's one of those things. Approximations. You should avoid using approximations. So don't say things like quite a large part or very few or some. If you find yourself using that, go back and find the number or make something more specific. Here's a direct quote from the APA manual saying that approximation weakens your statements, especially when you're describing something that you can count. Use the numbers. Okay. So let's take a breather for a sec. We talked about the things we can't do in APA or shouldn't do. See how I use two contractions there? Now we're going to talk a little bit about how to use sources inside of your paper. So when you're using sources in a paper, there's multiple ways you can do it. You can use a direct quote, you can paraphrase, or you can use a signal phrase. These three are examples of signal phrases. I'm saying things like Burke argued, or as Jung said, or according to Zimbardo. I'm signaling that I'm using a source. This is one of those things that really helps you become a moderately good writer, where you move from novice to moderate, is using signal phrases. When you use signal phrases, there's some rules that you need to follow. So for example, this here is a signal phrase with a direct quote. And I have, as these researchers say in their book, comma, and then I have a quote, and then I give my quote. You'll notice here at the end I have parentheses, and I have the page number. And then I have the period at the end. The parentheses are part of my sentence, and the page numbers are part of my sentence. P4 here is to indicate the page number. If you didn't know the page number, you shouldn't use a direct quote. So, for example, I have my second sentence right here. In this sentence, I'm not using the direct quote, so I don't need the page number. So I just say, I summarize what's going on in that full example in one sentence. I say a writer needs to use another person's point of view to engage in academic dialogue as stated by, and then I list the authors. This is a little bit of a nuance. If I have a source that the page numbers are a little funny on, and I'm just not sure what the page number is that I'm pulling the quote from, don't use the quote. Just paraphrase it or summarize it. You also should notice that I'm including the page numbers, or not the page numbers, the year, right here, right after the authors. That goes into something we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute, but I'm indicating when it was published. That's almost part of my signal phrase. So you've heard me say this, paraphrase or summarize. What does that actually mean? Well, paraphrase means you're reiterating what someone said, but not using the direct words. You're rewriting what someone said in your words. You're maintaining the original intent and character of the work, but you're just not using it exactly. That needs the source right at the end, and that goes just like we talked about with the year. Other times you can summarize the source, which is just also not using the exact wording, that you're writing in your voice, and that you're taking the broad overview of the source, but you can also be critical and you can offer praise. So when you're going to write an annotated bib, what you're looking to do is write a critical summary of the source. Okay, so parenthetical documentation. This is a real fancy way of saying in-text citations. We talked about this 2 slides ago, where we were talking about the 12 and then the page number. APA uses parenthetical documentation. MLA does as well, although differently. Not everyone does. Some use footnotes, but APA and MLA use parenthetical or in-text citations. This is to help the reader of your paper understand where an idea is yours versus where it is from someone else. And they look like this. So here we have a signal phrase according to Edwards, and then we have the year. Librarians need to move more deeply into the classroom and develop courses on critical thinking and information literacy. You notice here I don't have a direct quote, so I don't need the page number, and I indicate the year. So it's pretty clear that this is not coming from me, that this is, hey, my buddy over here, Edwards, said this. Every source like this, where it says according to and then there's a year, is going to have a reference on the references page. It's just that simple. Whenever you do something like this, where you're using a source, you've got to include them on the reference page. Now, here's a question. Here's a reference. We talked about references last week. Do you notice anything wrong with this one? There's one thing that stands off right away. Only the first word of the title and the subtitle, or proper nouns, which I don't have any here, should be capitalized. I'm telling you, it stands out. I've read too many of these annotated bibs. Please make sure that when you're doing your references on your annotated bib, that it doesn't look like this. That you only capitalize the first word of the title, first word of the subtitle, and proper nouns. But back to this week's lecture. Sources like this, where you're using them in your paper, need to correspond to an entry on the reference list. So, direct quotes. Again, we talked about this a little bit a minute ago. If you're using a direct quote, like this, I can use a quote without a signal phrase. I can say, one critic of the experiment insisted that subjects should have been fully informed about the possible side effects. I then put the author's name, I then put the year, and then I put the page number. When I'm naming the author in my text and I break it out like this, I say Smith, 2005, insisted that the subjects in the study, quote, should have been fully informed about the possible side effects, end quote. There's my page number. So I can use page numbers with the author in the text and the author without. And thankfully, that is the end of this week's lecture. Before I let you go, heads up, the annotated bib is due at the end of this week. There is the rubric for it, which is right here, which is how your paper gets scored. It's fairly cut and dry. If your citation and your annotation is perfect, you're going to get full marks. If not, you'll get a little bit in the middle. And then if your annotation is like non-existent, it's going to be a 0. Make sure you submit something. Make sure you send me something. I'm more than willing to look these things over before it's actually due. So if you want to send it to me in advance, go ahead and do that so then I can look at it and let you know. I'm also a big fan of, if it's not very good, I'm going to send it back to you. I'm going to say, hey, rewrite this. We're in a little bit of a bind because we're towards the end of the semester. But if I do that, I need it back by the end of the following week. So you'll see as we go. If I need a rewrite, I will let you know. If I don't, it's all good. But when you're doing these annotated bibs, if you have any questions, if you're curious about how you do something, or formatting is giving you an issue, or any of that, shoot me an email. I'll put it in this week's announcement, my email, so you just have to click it and then send me an email. And we'll make a time and we'll either talk or communicate through email on how to go about fixing whatever issue is coming up and bothering you. The examples of annotated bibliographies are in last week's lecture, last week's module in D2L, so you'll see the examples of the annotated bibs for you to replicate and use. Biggest tip I can give you is use scholarly articles because they're easy to cite, and you can use the library's databases to give you the base citation to then pull into your annotated bib. And with that, I will leave you to it. This is due on the 25th, so that is, I believe, Sunday. Hang on. Pulling up a calendar. That is, in fact, Sunday by 11:59. So I can get to it bright and early Monday morning. All right, all. Have a great week, and